Welcome to the first ever LawTech Live interview. Today I have Uwais from Simplexico, sorry. He has over 5 years of experience designing, building and delivering machine learning and NLP solutions across leading legal tech startups and a corporate innovation lab. He has held roles as a machine learning engineer at Eigen Technologies and as a senior NLP data scientist at Thomson Reuters Labs and Thought River. Uwais also holds a BSc and MSc in physics from Imperial College London and an MA in Islamic Studies from SOAS. So it's pretty safe to say you know what you're talking about. Please tell us what you're up to at the moment.
Hi everyone, my name is Uwais. Nice to meet you all. So I've been kind of building and designing legal AI solutions in the legal tech space for a while now. And then recently I started my own company called Simplexico. We're a legal AI consultancy and we're focusing on educating the industry about AI, busting some of the hype and clearing out some of the confusion when it comes to buzzwords. We're also doing some kind of custom model development and custom AI model development when it comes to contracts as well as case law, and then we're also doing advisory in the legal AI space.
Excellent. So let's move on to ChatGPT straight away. I know so many people have questions about this, so let's get it out of the way. What is the hype all about?
I think the hype train has definitely kind of like moved into a gear up with ChatGPT. But I think it's an interesting and cool technology, and it brings together different aspects of AI. So it brings together what's known as a language model, and I guess we'll come to speak about that later, along with like a chatbot interface, so you can kind of interact with it in a very kind of like intuitive and natural way as you would do with a normal human being. But I think a lot of the hype has come about because it's the first time people can actually like actively tinker with an AI model. In a way which is like natural, like a natural conversational expression rather than some sort of like crafted experience. So it's a very natural way of interacting with an AI model. And the ChatGPT is an instance of a generative AI model. And generative AI, it's kind of impressive in what it can cover because it can kind of replicate the human skill of drafting, so it can be used across like a wide variety of use cases. And then because people are able to interact with this and it was public access, so anybody could use it, I think it kind of opened people's eyes and it sparked people's imagination of how AI can be used and where it can kind of be used in particular industries like legal, for example.
And how does it work exactly compared to, say, some of the typical legal AI models that we've seen over the past few years?
Sure. So ChatGPT is actually based on another AI model called GPT-3 or GPT 3.5. And GPT-3 is a language model. And a language model you can think of as a sophisticated guessing machine. So the intuition is that with these models, we want to train them to try and develop an understanding of language. And you might have like experienced this when you're learning a new language or you're using an app like Duolingo. One of the tasks they give you is to try and like fill in the blanks. They'll give you like a sentence, it'll be a missing word and the rest of the sentence. And then as part of your exercise as a language learner, you have to like figure out what the blank is. So using the intuition, what these language models have to do is they take these sentences of text and they basically have to guess the missing word, and then that can either be like in the context of a sentence or like at the end of a sentence. So it's basically like an exercise in filling the blanks. And the GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, they were trained on like a large amount of publicly available data on the internet. So I think it was around 500 gigabytes. So through that exercise of filling in the blanks on this large volume of data, the model was able to learn things about language in terms of like how language is structured, how to understand language, but then also in terms of how to generate meaningful responses and fill in the blanks in terms of giving a cogent response. So that's the underlying language model. And then that's been around since around about 2020. So it's been 2 years since GPT-3 has come out. And then beyond that, what ChatGPT kind of developed further was this idea of using a conversational interface. So the prompts for the conversations were trained with reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning is a type of training you can do with an AI model, and it's quite similar to how you might train a pet, for example. So when you're training a pet to perform a new skill, you'll have like a carrot and a stick. So when it does well, you might give it a treat, and if it does badly, you might kind of reprimand it. And then through that experience, your pet will learn like this is the expected behavior or the desired behavior, and it will move towards that. So this reinforcement learning scenario was set up where I think they hired a bunch of contractors to draft these prompts as well as the desired output from the model and rank them. And through this kind of like repeated exercise of like telling the model what was like good responses versus what was poor responses, over time it developed an ability to give not just generate language, but also generate language in this conversational interface that can kind of give meaningful responses. So there's like a technical explanation for how all of this stuff works, and it can kind of get really interesting when you read some of the papers. But if you start thinking about it conceptually from a very, very high level, when you think about it and you break it down, generative models, and in particular ChatGPT, they kind of mirror how our imagination works. And I'll explain what this means. So like, say, for example, like give me something you can imagine that's not in the real world.
It's hard to do, right?
Yeah, it's not that hard to do once you crack it, once you get the gist of it. But so you can have like a horse with 4 legs, right?
I'm thinking of a banana in space.
You can think of a banana in space, right? So like what have you done to actually get to that, a banana in space?
Assemble 2 things I do know into something I don't.
Perfect. Yeah, that's it. That's the crux of it. So you've assembled things you already know into something that you don't know, and then that's kind of the intuition of how these models work, is that you have some memory of things you've experienced. So you know what a banana is, you know what space is, and you have an ability to kind of like divide those experiences of memory into like, and focus on like what a banana is and focus on what space is. And then you can like compose new scenarios from those images or from those kind of memories. So that's kind of how these models work when it comes to generative AI. They have like these this memory in terms of training data. So it's got the entire volume of what's available publicly on the internet. And then it's learned this skill of like composition and division in terms of like focusing on particular things. So if one way of thinking about how these models work is that like they have these semantic Lego blocks that it's learned from the data it's been given, from the memory it's developed. And then all the model learns how to do is how to kind of like see kind of a collection of Lego pieces, identify the individual blocks in that structure, and then figure out how to put them back together in a different way, so it kind of looks it looks like something correct, or it has the same correct structure. So that's like a conceptual way of thinking about how these models operate.
Looks like something correct. I think that's one of the key criticisms of ChatGPT, is it kind of talks very confidently and in a humanistic kind of way, right?
Yeah, and this is kind of where these models, they're impressive, but they're also very like dumb at the same time. That all this model knows how to do is construct something which looks like a cogent piece of text, but there's no guarantee that the information it contains is factually accurate or it represents something real. It could be just fiction at the end of the day, but it's just developed a skill and it knows how to generate cogent text.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately it's like a lot of humans, and as it's built by humans, I guess it kind of follows along that trend. It's like, how can we code a way of thinking that we don't know? It's like imagining that object you don't know exists, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really cool because that's kind of where generative AI like has developed beyond the AI solutions we have, in terms of like being able to like have that. I don't know if you want to use the language of having an imagination, whether that's too far of a stretch of language, but having that ability to kind of take things together that it's seen to come up with something new that it hasn't seen. And then when you look at like the generative models when it comes to images like DALL-E and Midjourney, like you can definitely see that taking place. So it's more kind of like visual.
Yeah, and I guess the credibility of the information is where it can like become a bit uncomfortable. I mean, science is disproving other science all the time. It's like, one day you read an article about how coffee's good for you, and the next day you read about how it's bad for you. And I guess interpreting that and coming out with an answer can actually be subjective, because at the end of the day, I guess everyone is so individual, and coffee may be good for one person yet really bad for the other. And when you ask it questions, it knows nothing about you. So the answer can never really be inaccurate unless you're Google and perhaps tracking everyone's information.
I mean, that's, I guess, where these models get a bit scary, but it's definitely true that these models, they're very good at like playing this game of mimicry or giving the impression of knowledge, but it's basically these 2 or 3 skills that the models learn that gives the impression that it can do all of these things. But there's no guarantee that what ChatGPT and these generative models are producing is accurate. It's just fiction, and that fiction just happens to be correct some of the time.
Have my mic muted. Speaking of privacy and like data and the information you put in, I think it's obviously really smart that OpenAI have made the platform free and open, because I guess it's gathering ginormous amounts of data right now and using that to train future models. Coming to the subject of law, it's always been a huge concern when I kind of pitch my virtual data room platform to users. They ask, is it hosted in the US? Because there's a big concern there. And OpenAI are hosting that data in the US. And I also read in their privacy policy that they reserve the right to use the data you give to it in future training models or other products. I see that they're already partnering some big companies, and not going to name any names, but let's just say they don't have necessarily the best reputation for doing things ethically, like big drinks brands and the such like that. I see a lot of people rushing to integrate ChatGPT, and like they're putting in contracts and things. And I asked ChatGPT itself, as like, can you guarantee the anonymization of data? And of course it said no. Like the word king could be used in so many different ways. It could be in someone's name, address, company name. And it's like, is it a disaster waiting to happen when you have lawyers and the like freely putting in their clients' personal data and contracts, albeit anonymized to a degree, into a platform that can then be trained to be used in all sorts of manner that we don't yet know?
I think it's a very important concern that I don't think we've like thought about seriously enough. And a lot of the activity we've seen in the legal space, especially with ChatGPT and OpenAI, I think it's been driven by the shiny syndrome. And although it's slightly cynical, but the shiny syndrome, I think, is actually something real. That when new technology comes out, there's almost a drive or a race to see who can adopt it first, in terms of like showing the rest of the market who's leading the pack. But I guess technology can be used in different ways. One way is it can be used as a marker of like social status in some sense. But then the real question that comes underneath that is that although this technology is being brought into firms and it's being adopted, there always remains a question about adoption and usage. Like how many people are actually kind of using the tool, how many people are comfortable actually using it, and how many people have actually been trained to use it in a way where it's kind of compliant with all of the questions about privacy and kind of client data, etc. So I think on the one hand, it's there's a positive aspect to it as well, that it's about time that the legal industry caught up with technology, and I think it's probably a testament to where the industry is, that it makes headlines when somebody adopts a new technology, whereas that should be something which is the norm, not the exception. But then I guess with new technology, especially with AI models, which are so nascent, there's also things which need to be thought about in terms of data privacy and some of the legal concerns about client data. So the question, there's also the question you also raised around the future use of data that's input into the model. I think that's a massive concern, especially within the legal space. So there's already a huge court case underway. I think it's still active between OpenAI and some other kind of software developers. So OpenAI has another tool called GitHub Copilot. And the way this tool works is that you write in natural language the functionality of the code you want to build. For example, write me a function that will kind of split a document into the clauses or sentences, for example. And then the generative AI model, GPT-3, which powers it, will go away and it will write that code for you and come up with that. So this Copilot tool was actually trained on GitHub. And GitHub is a massive software repository of open source software and open source code. And then there's questions about data ownership, data provenance, and data privacy in terms of OpenAI leveraging that data to train GitHub Copilot, and then obviously benefiting from that in a commercial sense. So there's questions that come around when it comes to AI copyright and the data that's used and leveraged to train AI models. And then that's data which is kind of in the public domain, okay? And it's you can go on the internet, GitHub, anything on GitHub is kind of it's open source, it's free game. Anyone can go and read it. Anyone can kind of learn from it. Anyone can use that in their work, depending on the licenses, etc. Then what about the things which are much more private and which are behind kind of contractual obligations and behind kind of data privacy policies in terms of client data when it comes to law firms? So I think there's unanswered questions there. But when it comes to these AI models, the question around data privacy and future use of that data, I think that has to be understood and also addressed in terms of how people use the model and what they're allowed to put into it. Because we might see in the future where like there's this court case in action with GitHub, with the Copilot tool. There might be a similar something similar happening in the legal space with someone with confidential client data. And then if a law firm, for example, makes that mistake with client data, then that's their entire reputation and their entire business ruined effectively. So I think in the legal space, there's kind of these questions and these concerns which have to be thought about, and questions have to be asked more deeply.
Yeah, I think like Google have like a robots.txt that you can put on your website. It just says, don't crawl this website or don't crawl these pages. I guess something like that in code and information is required. I guess excuse me. I guess like I kind of follow the same mindset as like Elon Musk, who says he doesn't believe in patenting things because it stifles collaboration and creativity and, you know, prevents us getting to that next level. And, you know, I remember when Apple and Google were just fighting over patents constantly instead of like the focus being on innovating and doing exciting things. So I can see the benefit in this. But ultimately, if you put your heart and soul in something and invest a lot of money, the last thing you want is someone taking that data. So I do see where it is a very thin line, and I guess it depends on where you sit with things. But giving that choice to people is critical, I think.
Yeah, and I think maybe there's a deeper like legal and social question about like the nature of privacy, and in a world where like AI becomes the norm, whether like we shift our views on privacy or whether like we maintain like our understanding of ownership of data, of privacy of data and those rights, and then like mold our AI, mold the way we do AI or use AI to try and fit within that frame. So I think it's a different perspective.
I think one of the big topics in law, it shouldn't be necessarily what tools are best to summarize this contract or analyze this contract or red flag this contract, but how can we standardize contracts, like one NDA being a very basic example of that. Do you think that AI could potentially be used to, say, analyze hundreds of complex contracts and provide standardized versions?
So so this I think this is a good question, but I think we have to like be a bit more specific when we speak about AI, because there's two kinds of AI that I think are in the market at the moment, or at least like two kinds of AI that people are working towards. So on the one hand, you have strong AI, and then this is the sense of like artificial general intelligence, where you have an AI tool which is on the level of human intelligence and can do all of these different things just as a human can do. And then you also have weak AI, and weak AI is what's known as narrow AI, where your AI model is focused to do like very particular and focused things, like for example, like identifying a termination clause within a contract or extracting a few particular fields from the contract. So I think what's happening is that like a lot of the big tech players are focusing on strong AI, and then you see that with ChatGPT, it tries to be this one solution that can do all of these different things. But I think within the legal space, if you've like take a focus on weak AI and start asking questions about like if we really narrow down and focused on particular use cases or particular areas where AI can be used in legal, how can we do those really well? So if you go down the strong AI route, then you kind of like run into these questions about standardization. How do you make things as generalizable as possible? But I think the nature of the legal work and kind of the law is that it's always going to be bespoke, or it's always going to be different, or contracts will always have a different nature depending on who the client is, what the needs are, and like what the practice area is. So I take a different perspective, and this is what some of what we're focusing on at Simplexico is, rather than like taking a view on AI which tries to generalize and do everything, is that if you like try and make things as narrow as possible, what's the minimum possible domain or the minimum possible problem you can try and kind of develop an AI solution around and push things forward. So I think it's a different perspective.
Thanks for that. And stepping aside from ChatGPT, like what are some other, and along those lines, what are some cool use cases for AI that you've seen?
Sure. So AI tends to get spoken about like in very broad terms, and I think like we have to try and move away from that. So like talking about AI in one sense is like talking about electricity. Like it's out there and it can power different things. And rather than talking about like electricity, we usually speak about appliances. So you have a dishwasher, you have a computer, you have a television, you have a microwave, you have these electrical appliances. And I think in the same way with AI, we have to like start speaking about AI applications, or what we've tried to introduce is this notion of AI actions. So with AI, you want to try and, in a narrow sense, you want to replicate some human ability or some human problem-solving capability. And then we've kind of, within the legal space at least, we've like identified these 8 actions where AI can be applied in a meaningful way. So one of the first areas is around extracting information. And then this is going from unstructured data in the form of like loose text and contracts into more structured data in a database where you can actually use that for some sort of intelligence or analytics. So one use case is around using AI to extract information. Another use case is around using AI to compare information. So if you have 2 clauses or 2 documents, AI can be used to try and like find similarities or kind of give an estimation of how different those documents are. Then a third use case is around organizing information, and this is what you see in like the e-discovery space, where AI is used to ingest large amounts of data, and then you can kind of automatically organize that in a meaningful way. A fourth use case is around labeling information, and this is kind of what's normally known as classification. So like you can classify a document or you can classify a clause in a particular way. Another use case is around finding information. And then this is like where the search and the ChatGPT functionality overlaps. So you can use AI models to find relevant information. You can give queries and you can find things which are in large data sources. And then there's these generative AI use cases, which I think are kind of like the cutting edge of where we are at the moment. One of them is around drafting information. And then this is, again, where ChatGPT is quite cool, that you can use ChatGPT to try and draft either emails or kind of stubs of text. And another generative use case is around summarizing information. So given a long form piece of text, maybe a case text, AI can be used to generate like a short form summary, like a head note for a case, for example. So I think these are some cool use cases that we've seen where AI can be used, and I think in particular in the legal industry, if we start moving away from speaking about AI in the same way we speak about electricity, and we start speaking about these applications or these actions, I think we'll have much more meaningful conversations, and people will understand each other a lot more.
So models like ChatGPT obviously are based on a lot of information. We chatted about the coding copilot earlier and how that was using public information available. It's easy with Google. If you're searching for something, you can see the immediate source of where it came from, and quite often they would cite sources as well. But how do we verify? How do we solve the challenge around the transparency of the information, say, ChatGPT is providing to you?
Sure. So I think this is an interesting question, and I think it goes back to like thinking about what an AI model is like fundamentally made of. So I have this analogy of that you can think of an AI model as like a dish, like a dish prepared in a kitchen, for example. So you have the data, which are like the ingredients which go into the dish. And then you have the algorithm or like the math behind the model, for example. And then that's like the recipe, the steps you have to follow to get to the using the ingredients to get to the actual dish. And then you have the kitchen, which is like where you do the work, like the computing environment or the computational resources you use to actually create the model. And then you have the chef, who's like the data scientist or the AI person who actually kind of like uses the ingredients with the recipe and cooks it on the stove to actually make the model. So I think when you think about an AI model from that perspective, it's kind of made up of different components, and when those components come together, you get like the final product. And one way like AI can be offered or AI models can be delivered is through like SaaS products. And then that's what we're seeing with like OpenAI and like a lot of other legal AI offerings is like AI capabilities are embedded within SaaS products. And then going with the analogy, this is like where you have like ready meals, pre-packaged almost, that you have something, you take it out and you can consume the meal right away. And another way which we're exploring, and kind of this is what we're doing at Simplexic, is whether you can kind of, rather than bringing the data outside of the kitchen and feeding it to the AI model, whether you can bring like the recipes into the kitchen instead, so the data never has to actually leave the kitchen. And then through that way, you kind of sidestep all of these questions about data privacy, data transparency, because the model is kind of very kind of bespoke to the data being used. So it's just a different in perspective that if you're able to bring a personal chef into the kitchen, nothing ever has to leave the kitchen. So you really don't have any worries about data transparency, data privacy. Whereas if you're sending your ingredients out and your data out, then you're never quite sure how they will be used or where they will end up. So I think it ultimately depends on like where the value is placed, whether the value is placed on using like new and innovative technology, and we're willing to take that risk of giving our data away or not really having transparency of where our data is used, or whether we like value data privacy and data transparency more, and then we look to develop those things in kind of more controlled environments and situations. So I think the transparency challenge is always a tricky one. But there are kind of like ways of achieving that in the development of the models. So there are techniques that you can use in terms of model kind of interpretability and explanations, where the model provides explanations of how it comes out with the answers it comes out. But that has to be encoded into the recipe. That's not like you can add on something after the dish has been prepared. That has to go into the recipe phase, so it's baked into the solution. So I think thinking about how AI models are created and the components that go into it, we can try and like do things differently to solve those challenges.
That's a very comprehensive answer, as always. I don't think I've ever spoke with anyone that can digest AI and provide it in layman's terms as good as you. So yeah, I can see what you're doing at Simplexico, and it sounds amazing, and I encourage anyone to check it out. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been most informative. I've learned so much. I can't wait to upload this one.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.